Well, good evening, good afternoon. We are here to begin week 6 lecture for Human Resource Management 316, Employee Selection and Staffing. And tonight we're going to cover a job analysis, which is a very important task that human resource managers do. And of course, they can't do it by themselves. They have to do it in concert with supervisors and managers, etc. Now, the objective this week for you is to prepare, and actually the assignment, which is also part of the objective, is to prepare a detailed example of the major uses, the when, how, and why of a job analysis and its benefits to an organization. And I recommend, if possible, that you use your organization for gathering the information. Now, I like to point out that if you run into some issues with your employer, the information you're providing to me, it doesn't go anyplace. I don't share it with anybody. I do not want you to provide proprietary information. That's obviously something that should never be done. But if you can get some kind of an idea from the organizations you work for about how they prepare a job analysis and what they use it for, et cetera, it will help you in a couple of ways. Number one, it will help you for the course. But number two, and perhaps more important, it'll help you understand what your organization does and how they approach designing jobs and things of that nature. The key question we should ask, and should always be asked when we talk about job analysis, is why do organizations do this? Why do they go through the all the issues and the research and collecting information, et cetera, to have a job analysis? Well, the easy answer, at least to me, and perhaps it's the best answer, is so that the companies can assure themselves that the employees or their employees are completing the jobs and tasks for which they're hired. And it also helps the employee know what his or her job is supposed to be. Some organizations, and we'll talk about this a little bit more later, use the job analysis in the recruiting process. So, for instance, pardon me, if there's a job fair or something like that, they'll tell what they're hiring for, and they'll have at least a synopsis of the job analysis. They may not have it in great detail, but the employee has some kind of an idea what he or she is going to be doing on the job. And that goes hand in hand, pardon me, with what we've talked about before, and that's providing a realistic job preview for the prospective incumbent, for the prospective recruit, maybe is a better way to say that. And then hopefully that prospective recruit would eventually become a prospective candidate. So they have some kind of idea what it is they're going to do. It's really difficult to walk into any job from day one and not really understand what you're supposed to be doing from the beginning. Now, yes, when you go through orientation, and I'm talking about orientation at the job site, not company orientation about the policies and plans and rules and standards and things of those nature, and filling out the forms, etc. But I'm talking about actually being at the site and being oriented to your job. There's going to be some differences between what you find in job analysis and what you're actually going to do, but they should not be broadly different. Job analysis also tells a company the importance of the task the employee is going to perform, and it should in some fashion, and either the job analysis itself or the job description, enumerate the tasks and say this is the more important task. And by the way, you're going to see some of this in the forum discussion assignments you're doing not only this week, or that you did, which is due to today at 11:50 p.m., about in some fashion what Darling was doing didn't do for Chrysler, but more importantly, the Worthington case. And so when you're looking at the Worthington case, think about this, keep this in the back of your mind about job analysis, job description, job specification, and help those things, those concepts, and what you get out of the text, why we have those things, why organizations develop them, and see how that applied itself to especially the Worthington case, not so much the Darling case, but especially the Worthington case. But in some cases, it is in Darling. Now, Darling doesn't talk about job analysis or job description or job specification. It's a little bit different. But some of that applies there. It also goes on to tell us, does the employee need the skills spelled out by the job analysis? Now, that might sound silly to you when I say that. But by and large, it may or may not be true that he or she actually has to have those specific skills. Now, if we find out that they don't have to have those specific skills and they're not in the job description, maybe we need to look at redoing the job analysis. It may not be what we want. It may need to be changed. So what types of equipment are required? Is retraining necessary? And of course, that goes along with training and experience in the original part, but it may tell us that after some period of time, retraining is necessary for whatever reason it happens to be. What education or specialized retraining is required. Now, again, that's different than retraining. A job, as you find in the text, and you probably found other places as well, is a grouping of tasks that characterize the duties an employee is required to perform or required to complete, maybe is a better way of saying that, but I think you can use either word and it doesn't make too much difference. Okay, so what are the tasks? How do we know these tasks? We know them by developing the job analysis. And of course, we don't develop the job analysis, pardon me, in a vacuum. That's not just can't be done. According to Stewart and Brown, their human resource management linking strategy to practice text, developing job analysis is a process of systematically collecting and interpreting information regarding the tasks an employee is required to perform. Now, I want you to stop and think for a minute. If you're doing a new job, if you're doing a job analysis for a position that the company doesn't currently have, then you're going to have to do other means of getting that information. We'll talk a little bit about that as we go through. Job analysis is, according to our text, Caruth and Payne, Staffing the Contemporary Organization, the most fundamental of all HR tasks. And we should add, or at least I'm adding, it is the most important because it drives so many other things, or at least is the foundation upon which so many other things are built or decided or determined for an employee or a group of employees. The process involves getting the pertinent facts about a specific job from experts. Now, that experts are a combination of things, a combination of people as far as I'm concerned. Those are the current incumbents. Now, here I'm assuming, and you should be assuming along with me, that we're talking about a current job, not a job that we're going to construct, from the experts. And then you may want to go to supervisors and manager or the manager, or you may want to go outside the organization to somebody else who's performed these tasks in the past and pick their brain, if you will. From experts to determine the necessary tools and equipment required to perform the job, as well as the conditions, environmental conditions, under which the job is going to be performed. And you can find that information. I sort of changed it around a little bit on page 124 in the text. Prior to performing a job analysis, it is important or necessary to have an inventory of all the jobs that exist in an organization. So you know if what's there. And so you're not recreating the wheel, if you will. You don't need to do a job analysis if one's already been performed. But you can't tell that until you have an inventory of all the jobs in the organization. Your authors state, Caruth and Payne, that the final list should be equal to the number of employees within the organization, but that's not necessary. And the reason it's not necessary is that if you have one job analysis and 10 employees are performing the same job, let's say information programmer, information management specialist, or something like that, and they're doing the same exact job, you only need one job analysis. You don't need 10 job analyses at all. Now, I've said before, and I'll say again, that the supervisor or manager may want 10 so he or she can make notations, so he or she can observe that there are differences between the jobs that each of these 10 are performing, and therefore a new job analysis or analyses need to be generated. But HR folks only need one, and then they would need a notation on it to say 10 people performing this job. Maybe they'd have the names attached to it, or the positions, or whatever they feel is necessary. Suppose you had, and I mentioned this, the 10 programmers. The HR department needs just one copy, and we'll note that there are 10 incumbents. However, the supervisor probably does need and should have the 10, as I've mentioned. If, however, each of these programs performs a different function or different functions, or their jobs are significantly different from each other, then 10 job analyses are required, one for each programmer, indicating the differences in the job requirements. Now, remember, the big thing to remember here is that you cannot and should not ever tie the job analysis to the incumbent by name. So you have to be very careful about this when you're developing a job analysis, so that the job analysis is not individual specific. It has to be specific to the job. And then, as I say, if we find somewhere along the line that the job tasks have changed for whatever reason, then you change the job analysis. You generate a new job analysis. You don't say, okay, well, Johnny Jones is here, and when Johnny Jones leaves and Sally Smith comes in, we're going to change the job analysis. No, you don't do that. They only change the job analysis if the job has been changed. So you do another analysis to make sure you're still current. And by the way, what I'll probably mention this sometime later tonight, and is that if the job analysis, well, I just lost my train of thought. Oh, yes, the job analysis should never be considered as static. Job analysis changes, jobs change all the time. And so we need to be cognizant of that, and job analysis should be continually revised over a period of time. Now, does that mean you need to do it every month or every quarter? No. But you need to take, you need to do some review of jobs on a periodic basis, maybe determined in sync with the HR folks, so that the job analysis doesn't stay the way it is, and then you find out when the incumbent leaves, transfers, gets promoted, retires, whatever it happens to be, that the job analysis is incorrect. So you want to keep the job analysis as current as possible. So, maybe an annual review or every other year review, something of that nature. Maybe it doesn't need to be done that often, but there should be some systematic way of or method or schedule set up to make sure that you review job analyses on a fairly frequent basis. Now we're going to put some slides up here, and we'll talk about these. After verifying the number of jobs within the organization, job analysis process begins. And according to Stewart and Brown, it consists of the following steps. And we're going to get to those steps shortly. I'll talk a little bit about this, and you can see these, and then we'll get to the steps and go through the steps as we see them up there. One of the first things you need to do is to get organized and decide who is going to perform the job analysis. This is just talking about it here, and then we're going to get to the slide that actually shows these next. So who's going to do the job analysis? And does that mean that it's going to be someone in HR who's going to do it, or someone in HR is going to be the focal point, be the collection point? Is it going to be the supervisor or the manager? The next step it talks about here is getting support from senior management. And that's all. Anytime you start out to do something along these lines, it's always critical to get senior management buy-in. Let them know you need to know to make sure that you're whatever it is that you need to do, that you need to stay on track. You need to verify that people are doing these jobs, etc. The next step talks about choosing jobs. And what this really means is giving first priority to the jobs that are most critical for our organization's success. So if you have an organization that has 600 different jobs, each and every one of those jobs does not have the same level of performance, doesn't have the same level of requirement, doesn't have the same level of importance to the organization. So you want to make sure that you're getting the biggest bang for your buck at the beginning and concentrating, the word just went out of my mind, concentrating on the jobs that are most important first. Doesn't say not to do the rest of them, just says concentrate on those first. And then the next part of that is you want to, if possible, if it goes along the same way, you want to focus on job that has the greatest number of people working in it. Now, there's a reason for that, because it's part of the way you do the analysis. Then the next thing is perhaps maybe this is critical and goes up to step one, and that is looking through your files to see if somebody has already done this work. Now, even if somebody's already done the work, doesn't mean that your task stops there. What it means is you now have what I would consider to be a benchmark. Somebody has determined that this is what the job analysis is, and now you're going to go back and do various things to determine whether what has already been done is correct or it needs to be changed. Then figure out the job agents. Now it says job agents here, and I don't know that that's a real good term to use. You may want to use a different term. I prefer current employees as opposed to job agents, but that's the term. I'm not going to worry too much about that. So what it says, and we talked about this before, you can use the folks currently performing the jobs. You can use those people's supervisor or manager. Or as I mentioned also before, you can get some person who's an expert who may not be working for the company, or could be somebody who did used to have that job and has now moved into bigger things within the organization. Now, one of the things that you have to be careful about here is if you get somebody who's an expert, or this person that I mentioned has moved on to bigger and better things in the organization, he or she needs to be current with the most up-to-date procedures and techniques and tools and equipment that are being used. So you have to make sure that that expert, that person that you're getting, besides these other folks, and I'm not saying that they should be excluded. make sure that they are still current in the field so that the information they're giving you is as accurate as possible. Now, and that's what this says, but the next step, you want a representative sample of the field. Now, when I was doing this for a small nonprofit organization that I worked in or for, what I would do is I would go to the incumbent. We'd have something filled out, and we'd ask them to fill that out. And then I would interview the incumbent after this. Now, what I'm telling you here is very labor intensive, but I didn't have that many employees to be concerned about. So I had the time, and of course, it went with my job. But you'll see this here in a minute. We expand upon this here in a second. Just needed to check on something a second. Make sure we're recording. We are. And then once I was finished with that, we would have the original input. Then I would sit down and talk with them and question, just to clarify, to gather other information or to corroborate what had already been given to me. And I would go to the supervisor and I'd say, okay, is this accurate? And then we would go over that and determine it was accurate or not. Maybe we'd go back to the employee and ask a few other questions, and then we would develop job analysis. And collection interview that's part of what I did, as I mentioned. Questionnaire is also part of what I did. We developed something and passed it out to the individual. And then you also do observation. Now, one of the problems that you have with observation is this. If you're familiar with Elton Mayo and his work at the Hawthorne Electric Plant in the late 20s and early 1930s, we found out that people who know they're being observed act differently. So one thing you could do here is, obviously, you could do the observation. Again, that's something that's labor intensive. But another alternative is to install a video camera. And you're recording the people at work. And of course, you're still doing the same. You have the same problem about people acting differently because they're being observed. The difference here is the camera versus people sitting there with their two eyes focused on what they're doing. But the idea of using a camera is that now the HR specialist, if he or she's going to do this analysis, can set the camera up, go back and get the camera, bring it back, and then watch the video at his or her own time rather than doing the observation. Then from that analysis, you're going to obviously create a job description, and then from the job description, you're going to create the job specification. So those are the two major documents that are created from a job analysis. And then what we do here is, when you're going to do job descriptions, you want to use action verbs. I believe that the text has a list of that. So you want to start out with an action verb. The reason you want to start with an action verb is because you use the job analysis and the job description as a basis for performance appraisals. And an action verb is measurable. And so you can't use a word like understand, because that's not measurable. But you could use something like analysis, analyze, or evaluate, something of this nature. Those are measurable because you know that there's something's going to have to be done after a person does this task. So those are the things that you want to do. The completed job analysis is a compilation of information and data that includes the essential job functions, duties, job responsibilities, resources required, performance standards, interpersonal relationships, if there are any. That would be reporting relationships, working relationships within a team, etc. Environment in which the job is performed, and determination of the minimum qualifications the employee must possess. Now, that'll be on the job specification. And I'm going to say it here, and I'm going to say it probably later before we're finished this afternoon, pardon me, in early evening. Job specifications have to be minimum, not more, minimum. Each of these components, I'm going to discuss them in detail. Now, we talked about the job analysis as having many purposes, and we're going to try to enumerate some of those. It helps in HR planning, having not only an inventory of current jobs, but a forecast of future jobs. It's a staffing guideline. Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act requires that staffing decisions be derived from job analyses. And so somebody's going to say, I can hear somebody saying to me, not necessarily any of you, but somebody will say to me and has said to me in the past, well, that's the government getting into the business. Well, I guess you can say that. And there may be some basis for that. But what happened is before we had something like this, people could do whatever they wanted in the job, and it was often based upon who you knew as opposed to what you could do. Now, I'm not going to tell you that who you know doesn't still play into these decisions, but certainly we should be making personnel decisions based upon what a person is able to do, as opposed to we like the way he or she parts the hair on the top of their head. That just doesn't make any sense. Basis for performance appraisals and for employee training and career development. I mentioned these again in the past, and this is back to what's in Title VII. Personnel decisions of promotion, selection, staffing, and termination. Again, back to Title VII. Training and education are also personnel decisions. To help assure for the employee's health and safety. Big issue. Now, OSHA, the Organizational Safety and Health Act, was not passed until the 1970s. So it is not generated necessarily from Title VII of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. But one of the things that employers have to be careful about is the health and safety and the environment in which their employees work. And if they aren't, that's what drives up workers' compensation costs and things of that nature. And it behooves an employer, not just his or her employees or her employees, it behooves the employer to have a safe workplace. For job evaluation, determining whether jobs are exempt or non-exempt, whether you are going to be paid a salary, the exempt person, because he or she is going to get the same amount of money no matter how many hours worked during a pay period, versus the non-exempt, a person who either punches a time card or, a better way of saying that, uses a time clock or signs a timesheet. And we know that that person, if he or she works over 40 hours in the work week, is going to be paid over 40 hours. You'd be paid time and a half for every hour over 40 hours worked. And notice I did use the term work week because work week does not have to correspond with calendar week. What that means is if your work week starts on Tuesday and ends on Saturday, as opposed to Monday ending on Friday, then that's the work week. And somebody who would work more than those hours is who's non-exempt is entitled to time and a half. The text enumerates additional uses for the job analysis, but these are, to me, the most important. And furthermore, the authors state that their list is not exhaustive. Prior to discussing this information in the preceding paragraphs, we need to spend more time discussing how data contained in the job analysis is obtained. And we have some of it here, which you can see. Stewart and Payne met above, and you can see on the slide here, figure 4.2 in their text, but this is slide number 12. Our text does not have slides with it. And by Carruth and Payne, the job analysis is developed using one of these collection methods: interviews, questionnaires, observation, or a combination of those three that we previously have mentioned. The questionnaire is rather simple. It's simple to understand and can be simply designed. I'm going to try to get a questionnaire here. Job analysis questionnaire. Human resources job analysts will meet with the employees and discuss the questionnaire and answer questions about how to complete the form. Analysts will also meet with the department supervisor and discuss the instrument to assure the supervisor receives the same information. Gomez, Mahia, Balkan, and Carty, in their 2012 edition of Human Resource Management, state the questionnaire asks a series of questions about the job's knowledge, skills, and ability requirements, duties, and responsibilities. Each question is associated with a quantitative scale, or is assigned a quantitative scale, that measures the importance of each factor or how often it is performed. Scores are then tallied by a computer, and I would like to point out to you that large companies will have an HR information system, and this piece of software may be included in that. Questionnaires are distributed and then they're returned to the supervisor. Now, the best way to do this thing is they're returned to the supervisor, and the supervisor places the completed questionnaires in an envelope and then seals the envelope when he or she has received them all and takes them to HR. He or she does nothing else with those questionnaires. The major advantage of a questionnaire, according to Stewart and Brown, is it is inexpensive. Companies will develop their own questionnaires and they'll pass them out. The text authors, Carruth and Payne, point out that the questionnaire has several disadvantages. Major advantage is it's inexpensive. Completion intrudes on the workday. So if you're going to give them to them, when do they complete these? They complete them while on the job or at the job site. Do they use their lunchtime? Do they use break time? Or what do they do? Employees may resent it. And since employees tend to overstate duties and responsibilities, the information obtained may be inaccurate, or using a little bit better word is it may be skewed. Data may be incomplete, meaning it hasn't been filled out, and not specific enough. Now, not specific enough could mean that the questionnaire was not well developed. And so maybe they were, instead of answering questions on like a scale of 1 to 5 or true or false, they were open-ended questions and asked for the job incumbent to fill it in. So you're going to have to figure out when you're developing this questionnaire what the best questions to ask are and how to ask them. You want to make, and by the way, I'm going to kind of contradict myself. If you're going to use a questionnaire, you want to make direct statements. I do this. I do that. I do not do this. Now, the reason for that is when you ask a question, you're raising the shadow of doubt or placing a seed of doubt in the person's mind. And so that can skew your results just as well. So you want to make a direct statement, which is easy to do. We're still going to call it a questionnaire, but we're going to make a statement. Now, there are some things under you may want to ask. You may want to get some demographics, such as how long have you worked here? How much experience do you have on the job? What sort of education do you have? Do you hold a certificate or a license or something of that nature? That just gives you some kind of overall type information. That's not so much required, but it might give you a little bit better idea of how it's being answered. I would say you probably don't want to do that. You just may want to leave it to how long have you worked here and that kind of business. If you need that information, most likely you don't because it's not job related. Interviews. I get away from job analysis, so keep that. I won't keep that slide up there, so I don't want to confuse you. Interviews conducted by the job analyst. This is a person from HR using a structured questionnaire. The structured review is necessary so that each job incumbent is asked the same question. Otherwise, the information cannot be verified and cannot be accurately calculated. Now, having said that, that does not mean to say that the analyst who is conducting the interview shouldn't probe for in-depth explanation of the answers. Obviously, that person should. Now, the issue with that is the person has to be schooled in how to elicit additional information, how to get people to expand on their original answer without them feeling a little bit of angst or something of that nature. This can be very effective, this interview. A very effective way of obtaining the information you needed. And the interviewers, again, as I mentioned, have to be skilled at probing to enlarge upon the answers. The text authors say, this Cruth and Payne now, that there are downsides to this method as well. Some of them are, of course, first of all, you should have figured out it's time consuming and it is expensive. Expensive because you're taking the analyst away from his or her everyday job. Now, if that is part of the job, then that's fine. But ordinarily speaking, it's an additional piece of the job. So he or she's not performing the tasks that they do every day. And then you're taking an employee off the line, if you will. It's making a difference whether employees on the assembly line or anything else, but you're taking them out of the work site to concentrate on this interview. Poor interviewers will give us bad information. And also, sometimes they may be suspect by the person being interviewed. Again, employees are taken away from their duties, and they can see the interviews as threatening. In other words, oh, here we're going to do a job analysis, and we're checking up on what you do. And if we don't like what you do, we're going to change the job. So yeah, maybe that's an overreach on my part, but probably not, because you're actually asking those people some things, and you're getting into their knickers, and sometimes they don't like that. So you have to be very careful when you do interviews. Observation, on the other hand, has a very distinct advantage. Analysts can see exactly what's being performed, and then he or she records the characteristics, the core characteristics of the job. Gomez, Mahaya, Balkan, and Cardy state this technique is often used for routine jobs and allows the observer to record the job essentials in a relatively short amount of time. Now, notice what we said here, routine jobs. And so this would have to be some type of observation, at least to me, which would be very unobtrusive. The best way to do this is if you could do it and not be observed. In other words, the people you're observing don't know that you're there. Because then they're going to be true to what they're doing. If they know you're there, the Hawthorne effect is going to come out. That's just human nature. We talked about this before. The analyst may choose to use videotape, and he or she can videotape the job incumbent while tasks are being performed, and it can study it in greater detail at a later time, away from the workstation, away from the clutter, etc. Now, again, there's a problem here. And the problem is if the job incumbent knows that he or she is being videotaped, how are they going to act and react? Are they going to act and react the way they would normally on the job, or are they going to do something different? So, Hawthorne effect, we always have to stop and think about that. The text notes that there are negatives with this approach as well. They take time and are costly. You're going to send somebody out of HR up to the work site, wherever it happens to be, or work department, and he or she is going to either physically observe or do some videotaping. Analyst has to know the tasks that are being performed. Now, what that means is that, yes, they need to know that they're performing this particular task, but they need to know how important that task is. So then they have to understand the task itself. So that just makes the task of the HR person more complex, and it adds to the difficulty. It adds to the difficulty because they may not completely understand the importance of the task, and while they're physically there watching what's going on, or even when they bring it back at their workstation or trying to analyze it on their own time. This next should come as no surprise. Mental tasks are not easily observed. They may never be easily observed. They may never be observed well at all. So if there's some mental built into the task, and we know jobs have changed today, and many of us have to use computers to do our jobs. And I'm not talking so much about what I'm doing here, but we rely on the computer to help us do things. We know things about computer-aided design, computer-aided manufacturing. So we have to understand what the computer is going to do for us. And then we have to have the knowledge to be able to engage the computer to do what the computer is supposed to be doing. So there's a whole raft of things, and that can't be measured. People who know they are being observed act differently. I've talked about that. So then that makes the observation questionable. I know that's a repeat, but we have to stop and think about the Hawthorne effect and its importance in human resource management and human relations and in the workplace. I know we don't talk much about the Hawthorne effect, if at all, actually, in this course. And so what I recommend to you is to learn a little bit more about it, is to use Google or another search engine and type in Hawthorne, Hawthorne, or type in Elton Mayo, Elton, capital Mayo, and it will give you some information about the Hawthorne experiments and then the Hawthorne effect that took place at the Western Electric plant at Hawthorne, Illinois, again back in the 1920s, late 1920s and 1930s. Stewart and Brown agree with the authors that the best way to gather information for the job analysis is through a combination of interviews, questionnaires, and observation. So we're kind of rolling this thing together so we can get a cross-section of information that should lead us to a fairly good conclusion. Best combinations seem to be questionnaires and interviewers, questionnaires and interviews, or all three. So combine questionnaires along with interviews, and then all three. or all three. When using the former, the best technique is to interview the job incumbent with his or her completed questionnaire in hand. I mentioned that's what I did. I thought it was pretty decent. I don't know how the employees felt about it. I thought we got some pretty good information out of it. Nobody came back and beat me over the head or anything like that. And we didn't really change job analyses and job descriptions greatly based upon the information we gathered, but we had something a little bit more concrete than what we had before. This allows the interviewer to ask for clarification, as I mentioned before, of the information received and on the information on the questionnaire itself. Did you really mean this? Do you really do that? Explain a little bit more how that's done. So it kind of really gets you in I think, in a pretty good frame of mind for what you're trying to do. The interviewer can then follow up with the employee supervisor as a check and balance. Again, I mentioned that's what I did. I found that to be very effective. And I really found that when I would do that, go back to the supervisor and ask if that was accurate, that most all the time it was accurate. And I mean, we made some changes here and there, but they were nuances. They weren't, radical differences. No, they don't do that. No, that's not right. It was a very enlightening experience to me because while I knew about job analysis before, it was the first time I'd ever actually done something like that. Designed a questionnaire and followed up with an interview. And being small organization, observation was just out of the. We couldn't consider that because there was no way we could do it and be unobtrusive. Combining all three collection methods provides a more rounded and thorough job analysis. I would say that's probably correct. I mean, I wrote it. I always say it's correct, but in rethinking it, I would say that's probably correct. I think what you have to determine is what our resources are, what are we allowed to do, what can we do, how do we want to approach this? Do we have the time and the resources? If we do, fine. Let's do a holistic type job description by using all the methods that we possibly can. Excuse me, job analysis. But if we can't, let's home in on things that are going to give us the best information we have. The advantage of this method, using all three, is that the job is analyzed using written, oral, and visual means to gather data. So we're not limiting it to one of our senses. We're using sight, we're using visual, and we're using oral. So we're getting the written word, the spoken word, and we're watching. And we should get some kind of pretty good idea and a check and balance as to whether or not what we've come up with is realistic. So I think we need to stop and think about that. One way of getting information for a job analysis or relying on one method is not a good approach. But we do have to determine what the best approach for us is given our limitations. And we always have limitations, X number of resources, X number, a certain amount of time, etc. So we need to think about those and balance those things against the requirement that we have to build a job analysis. Well, we've come almost to 5:21, and I want to take a 5-minute break now to 5:26, and we'll come back and finish what we have here on job analysis. Thank you. Please come back at 5:26. All right, it is 5:26. We're back. We're still talking about job analyses and methods used to collect the information. Gomez, Mahaya, Balkin, and Carty in their human resource management textbook mentioned two other collection methods. One is a diary, and the other is internet-based. And with the diaries, incumbents are asked to complete a diary of daily work or the compilation of their daily work activities in the amount of time spent performing each task. The diaries are then analyzed over a period of time by a job analyst, and essential duties are separated from marginal because the essential duties are captured from that diary based upon the amount of time that's spent on each task. And remember, and we're going to talk about this, and I have a slide I'm going to put up here shortly, it is very important to capture the difference between essential tasks and marginal tasks on job analysis, in the job analysis, and the job description. In the latter, the internet-based, pardon me, the HR folks put the job analysis questionnaire on the company's intranet. This is essentially the same as a written questionnaire, but then a software program analyzes the responses and summarizes, pardon me, job characteristics using standardized job descriptors. So you would have a form that the employee would fill out, or the employees would fill out, and it would be based upon these standardized job descriptors. This method takes less time to gather and analyze data. Now, of course, you have to be concerned that the information being inputted is accurate. ONET, that's O with an asterisk net, all capital letters, which is from the Department of Labor, developed this data collection method and has information on more than 800 jobs across the country. Information includes data on tasks, knowledge, skills, and abilities needed to perform these 800 jobs. And you could do this ONET. I believe, and I'm going to give you an ONET website here a little bit later, but I think you just type in onet.gov to access the ONET information. And I'm going to double check that, and I'll send that to you, because if you get involved in this, if you start working in HR and become a job analyst or whatever else, you don't have to recreate the wheel. Somebody has already done a lot of this information. Maybe not at your employer, but somebody's done a lot of this information, and so you should go get that information and then use that information to have as a benchmark and bounce against that information, the benchmark information, what the employee in the particular job being analyzed is doing, or employees are doing. And so you can determine without going through a lot of work whether or not your employees are doing what seems to be standard across that job across many fields in the United States, many organizations in the United States, not many fields in the United States. Another important piece of the job analysis, I'm going to put this up, is assuring each one developed conforms with the Americans with Disability Act. That was signed, as you know, in 1992. The Act mandates that organizations clearly define the essential functions of a job, and those that do not fall into this category be labeled as non-essential or marginal. And it shows you right here. For a person who falls under ADA to be considered for a job at your organization, he or she only has to perform the essential tasks of the job, not those that are nice to do, not those that are considered marginal, only the essential jobs. And that's exactly what you would have any other employee do. So we're not creating something different here for the ADA folks. When you're going to do a performance appraisal on somebody, your performance appraisal should home in on these job essential tasks, not those others at the periphery, not those that don't have to be performed. And the job analysis and the job description should tell you what the consequences are of not performing those non-essential tasks, the marginal tasks. You know, is the world going to fall apart if we don't do those? Probably not, but we need to say that. So again, here, and you know, we need to add the last part of this for the ADA folks. That's with reasonable accommodations. And I think we've made it clear in the course before this. And if we haven't, I'll do it again, or I'll do it now. And if I've done it before, I'm repeating myself. And that is, the key phrase is reasonable accommodation. And courts have clearly held, that if the accommodation requested is not reasonable, the organization does not have to make those accommodations. And I think I used an example before, and if I didn't, I apologize. A fellow wanted to get, was a man, wanted to get a job with an organization, and he fell under ADA, and he said, well, then I'll do this. I'll have to, assembly line is going to have to run counterclockwise, not run clockwise. And the company said, we're not going to do that. That's not reasonable. He took them to court, and the court said, yeah, that's not reasonable. You can't make them change their procedures just to suit you. Employers must consider the following to assure a job analysis is in compliance with ADA requirements. Give you some more here. Go to this next slide as well while I'm giving you my notes. The job analysis must be in writing, enumerating the job essential tasks. The job analysis development method must be clearly described. This is how we got this: interviews, questionnaires, combination of both, or combinations the way we've talked about. Job analysis experts should collect the data from current sources. So you don't want to have dated information. It has to be current. Specify the level of competency needed for entry-level jobs. Probably should specify the level of competency needed for every job, but certainly for entry-level jobs, you want to do that. Time necessary to complete essential functions, and the consequences of not performing essential not performing essential functions, and of not performing non-essential functions. Now, I think we can probably think in our minds. We have a pretty good idea what's going to happen if they don't do non-essential functions. The task is not going to be completed. But we have to make sure that we say that. And so it's pretty clear, and it's clear for every incumbent whether he or she falls under ADA or not. Important to remember that employees are not required to perform non-essential tasks. I know that's a repeat. I need to say it again. And it is doubly true for those who fall under ADA protection. It's also important to omit, and you won't always see this. This is my line here, and I've been guilty of using it because it kind of was taught to me, and my background, or Army background. It is also important to omit the standard line of "and other tasks," parenthesis, duties as assigned. That's a very problematic statement and should be avoided at all costs. You know, it shouldn't be on performance appraisals. It shouldn't be on job analyses. It shouldn't be on job descriptions. You just have to stay away from that because that's going to get you into a jackpot, and you don't need to be there. So don't add what you don't need to add. Gomez, Mahia, Barkland, and Carty provide another example of why a thorough job analysis is necessary. Let's suppose an owner of a small restaurant pays his or her assistant manager a salary, making that person an exempt employee, instead of an hourly wage. The owner can protect him or herself from charges of overtime, of not paying overtime under the provisions of the Fair Labor Standards Act by showing via a job analysis that the preponderance of the assistant manager's duties are in supervision and not in food preparation. Because the assistant manager is a supervisor, that is, he or she is directing the efforts of others, he or she can then be deemed as exempt, salaried employee, and not eligible for overtime wages. Really critical for a small business to be able to do that. Now, I'm not talking about a small business that's a franchise, because the franchise has probably already gone through that. The franchisor has probably already gone through that and would make that information available to the new franchise owner, and then he or she would be well ahead of the game. Most small businesses, unfortunately, don't get into doing job analysis, job description, job specification. Why? They don't have time to do it. They're more interested in and concerned about making a dollar, making a profit, being able to keep the lights on and do the things that are required to do so they can stay in business, pay their employees, meet their requirements, et cetera, and have some money to take home at the end of the day after they've paid their bills. But it is incumbent upon any business owner that he or she have something in place that resembles a job analysis, a job description, and a job specification. People can and will, I'm talking about employees here now, can and will sue because they said, well, they didn't have the right information, or they were being terminated because for unjust cause. And so if you have something and there's some analysis that's done behind it, there's some logic behind what you've done, and you can show that it is unbiased, then you're not going to have those problems. I'm not saying that's going to happen, but you don't need to have it happen, and doing a small amount of paperwork is going to keep you well ahead of the power curve, so you don't get caught the problem. Okay, now we've talked about this job analysis, but we really need to go back, or at least I think we need to go back, and I think it's beneficial for us to go back and examine the essential data information that's part of the job analysis. So we're going to go back here and back to one of the slides we used before, and we're going to say essential job functions, duties. This outlines the purpose of the job, the tasks performed, and the time spent on tasks. We don't always think about that, time spent on tasks. And so there should be some way of recording that. Yes, we're going to have difficulty if there's mental acuity required, because it's very difficult to measure that. How often duties are performed, the task's complexity. It should be shown the complexity for each task that's performed within the overall job, and its difficulty. And most importantly, which tasks are essential for job completion and those are considered non-essential. I know that's about the third time I've repeated that, but it bears repeating. Those are the things that, we're talking about here now about fundamentals. And those are the things that are, when they're not completed, that get us into trouble. and because we can't say that here it is. If God forbid that you have to terminate somebody, you want to terminate them on objectives, what the person did or didn't do, or mostly what the person didn't do, based upon a job analysis and a job description. And it would be backed up from personal, from performance appraisals, etc. But there has to be a basis in fact. And when there's not a basis in fact, then you get this problems of wrongful termination, and there's no sense in going through that when it could be precluded. Job responsibilities. It details the ancillary tasks that are associated with the job, or they may be embedded within the job. Is the employer responsible for procuring resources to complete the job, such as ordering equipment and supplies, managing monetary resources, number of employees, if any, that he or she supervises either directly or indirectly, in the nature of decision making that is inherent within the job. All those things need to be enumerated in some respect. Again, this just helps keep things on an even keel. Paperwork, yes. Tedious, yes. Required, yes. It helps you as the manager. I mean, even you as the manager, you as the owner, even if we never come up to a personnel decision, a termination, a wrongful discharge suit, things of that nature, it helps you because it helps you understand what's being done, when it's being done, how it's being done, and you have some measurement tool. Performance standards details what the employer is responsible to produce and the standards that he or she must achieve. Additional information regarding quantity, quality, time on task must also be determined. By the way, quality can be done as a measurement. Quantity we know is a measurement, but quality can be done on a measurement. And so it can be, in some respects, evaluated and needs to be, and that we need to think of it in those terms, because if we don't think of it in those terms, that's when we find ourselves having difficulty. Interpersonal relationships. This is probably as important to enumerate in or outline or detail in a job analysis as anything else. How often and with whom, and perhaps even for what reason or reasons, does the incumbent interact with others? Peers, if it's within a team, supervisor, team leader, or team facilitator. What's the frequency of the interaction? Daily, weekly, hourly? Is the incumbent required to interact with outside agencies or institutions or customers, and how often? Does the incumbent interact with other internal departments? Now, we're not talking about where he or she works, but with others within the larger company. How often does this occur, and in what capacity? So, if he or she is a department chief, then we know what that capacity should be. But if he or she is not, then what capacity? As an expert, just as a gopher? I don't think you probably want to do that, but you might. So we need to think about those things, what we're saying here. Organizational relationships. This is another important issue. How does the job fit within the organization's or support the organization's mission, goals, and objectives? I've said before, I'm fairly certain I've said in this course, and if I haven't, I apologize, and I'm going to say it again. Every person who works in an organization has to know how his or her job fits in with the overall organization mission, goals, and objectives. That goes all the way down to the janitor. By the way, I use that to show a job that's fairly far down on the totem pole in the hierarchy of jobs, but not to talk about an individual or demean anybody. That's an important job. To whom does the employee report? Organizational relationships, again, not different than interpersonal relationships. Where is the employee assigned? The employee supervisor manage employees. We talked about that before, but this is in a different aspect. Now, what is the typical upward progression? Job environment talks about the job's physical demands, such as the amount of time spent standing, sitting, etc. There is a move afoot. I don't know if you've seen it, to have people stand at their workstations as opposed to sitting a lot. Feel that it's better for them and better blood circulation, etc. We have an individual that works in our Center for Teaching and Learning, and that's what he does. His workstation set up that he stands. I guess he can sit when he wants to. I don't have it set up that way. I'm sitting here talking to you, and maybe I need to rethink what I'm doing. Anyway, and then as well as the working conditions, good lighting, poor lighting, good ventilation, bad ventilation, heat, etc. Noise, dust level, any other environmental hazards, any precautions needed. An individual need to wear hearing protection, need to wear eye protection, things of that nature. You know, if you work in a lab, you should always wear eye protection. I remember when I was in college and taking a chemistry class, somebody didn't put eye protection on and caused whatever they were doing caused a reaction, and something spit out of the beaker and got them right in the eye. Well, right beside the eye. I don't think it went in the eye, but there was all kinds of commotion that went on, and they sent us all home. You know, we'd only been there for like 15 minutes, and we're supposed to be there 2 hours. Like we all got sent home. So those are things you need to think about. Of course, that was back in many years ago, and people didn't always insist upon folks wearing eye protection. That has nothing to do with job analysis, by the way, but this is an example. Education and experience. Of course, this will be on the job specification, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, but these requirements are spelled out greater there in the job specification. By the way, you might see this in the lecture notes that says description. That's an error on my part. It should be job specification. I'll fix that. Minimum qualifications should be enumerated, as well as any special required criteria such as license or certification. Those must be noted. A job description is one of the criteria, or one of the forms, I guess maybe is a better way to say that results from the job analysis. I think I have something about job description here. Let's get to it in a second. Maybe we don't. Yeah, here we go. Job description. Completing a job description is not an easy task because the writer must have intimate knowledge, or the developer, maybe is a better way to say that, of the job and its content. Then the description must be turned into an understandable document that clearly spells out duties and responsibilities. Organizations need job descriptions for many reasons. One of the most important is realize when an employee must be terminated for not doing his or her job. Of course, we have to have a solid job analysis first to develop a solid job description. It is there, if there is not a, if there's not a job description, an employee appeals his or her termination, the organization will have a very difficult time defending itself against a wrongful discharge suit. Now, this is a position analysis questionnaire transcribed into what it says a smaller document called the job description. 2 parts: the job specification. That's what it focuses on. pardon me, knowledge, skills, and abilities needed to perform the job. And job description is used for many, 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 many things, as we've talked about in the past. Here's a graphic of a job description. Describes what's going to be done. If we look at the slide, it shows here a charcoal grill, which means we're going to have a cookout. But what do we need to do for that? The person operating the grill, now I'm going to assume this is not gas fired, has to know how to get the charcoal started. Now, of course, if it is gas fired, he or she has to know how to operate the gas. Has to be able to do those tasks. That's the skills. Knowledge is knowing how to do it. Skills is doing the operation part. Has to have the ability to do that. In other words, he or she has to be able to turn the food that's on there so it's not overcooked, etc. It could be considered a skill. And notice down here, focuses on characteristics of people. Can do, will do. A job description has several components. Job identification, job definition, and job delineation. Job identification contains the pertinent data and information that distinguishes one job from another. We don't want to have every job saying the same thing, at least on the document. It should include the title. What's the title of the job? The type, that is salaried or hourly the department in which the individual works, and the direct reporting relationships. Attention should be given to the job title. It must be specific so it's not confused with other jobs. And the job analyst should consult the Dictionary of Occupational Titles, or O*net. The source contains not only job titles but descriptions as well. So you can have a standard description. Again, you're not reinventing the wheel, and you can add your specifics to that. The job delineation is simply a statement of the job's purpose. It's a summary of all the data and information included in the job description. I'm sorry, that's the job definition, not the job delineation. I didn't read my note properly. Job definition, statement of the job's purpose, summary of all the data and information. Job delineation spells out the essential and non-essential duties, activities, and relationships. And again, it must be clearly spelled out, but it should be concise. In other words, you don't want to write an encyclopedia about it. The sample job description can be found at figure 5.2 on page 110 in your text. The job description, as all job-related documents, must be written with care and avoid jargon and slang. And be very careful about that, because you want that to be understood across a wide spectrum. And if you use jargon or slang, it's only going to be understood probably by those people who understand that, not by someone else. Because the document is used as the basis for a performance evaluation, standards must also be enumerated. Pardon me. Gomez, Mejia, Balkin, and Carty state that it is best to assure the job description is accurate and is not inflated. Now, remember, that takes us back to job analysis and collecting through questionnaires that the job incumbents have a tendency to inflate. You don't want that inflation. You want what the minimum standard is. Don't make it more impressive than what it really is. Job analyses and job descriptions should be verified by the incumbent supervisor. We've talked about that before. It's just kind of a rehash of what we've said. And this ensures that the actual job duties are not misrepresented. Gomez, Mejia, Balkin, and Carty also state There's a new type of job description. It's the general job description. It's associated with job strategies that emphasize innovation and flexibility. This type of description is best used in organizations with few boundaries between departments and between job functions and layers of management. So we're talking here about a flat organization as opposed to a stovepipe organization. It uses generic descriptions regarding duties, skills, and responsibilities because they can be used in any department. For example, the duties, etc., of a supervisor remain the same regardless of the type of employees that he or she is supervising. Now, think about what that just said. That's a very simple statement. So what they're saying is that if you're homing in here on supervision, the tasks of a supervisor should be the same across the board, because we're not talking about technical skills here. We're talking about management supervisory skills, maybe in some cases leadership skills. So that's pretty easy to understand that, but we have to think about it in that fashion. Technical is someplace else, and technical can be added, but we're homing in here on generic that we expect every supervisor to perform. Job specification comes next, and it spells out the minimum qualifications needed to perform satisfactorily. They include education, experience, skills, known as KSAOS, knowledge, skills, abilities, and other characteristics. I should have added that. Ivancovich, in his Human Resource Management text, 9th edition, 2004, says any skills or characteristics noted on the job specification are tasks that must be performed. Otherwise, it's not in compliance with ADA requirements. Just saying it again, saying it a little bit differently. We're talking here about the job specification. We talked before about job analysis and the job description. This is just reinforcing what we've already said about ADA requirements. Gomez, Mejia, Balkan, and Carty say the minimum qualifications are the job's standards. If the incumbent has acquired additional skills or education, they should not be listed on the job specification. Say it again, not listed on the job specification. For instance, a college degree may be part of the minimum qualifications for a new accountant, but probably not for a fast food restaurant shift supervisor. It is also important to write these specifications so that they do not include potential employees who fall under ADA. To be inclusive, minimum qualifications could substitute classroom supervisory training in lieu of actual experience. In this way, potential employees who fall under ADA would be included. And I want to repeat here about minimum. Job specifications should have minimum requirements, nothing more, nothing less. If you inflate the job specifications and hire an employee who starts to work and then realizes that he or she is overqualified, then you're going to run into problems, because he or she is going to understand pretty quickly that is overqualified, not going to be challenged on the job, and therefore has a greater propensity to look for a job outside the organization. I don't need to be here. They don't need me. I need to go someplace else. And so you're going to go back through the process now of recruiting and selecting, et cetera, which is costly to the organization. So do not inflate. And it goes for the job analysis and the job description as well. but really important is job specification, because here we're talking about education requirements, experience, etc. Because this job specification information usually comes from either the supervisor or the current employee, the qualification may be inflated. I'm kind of remaking the point here. It could cause problems. You may be barring perfectly qualified people from applying because you've set the bar too high. You don't want to do that. It's going to also drive up compensation packages. If we set the bar up here and say, okay, here's where it is, and we look out at the industry and they're paying this person $50,000, this employee, type 1 employee, $50,000 a year, when in fact that employee maybe only should be paid $45,000 a year. We've inflated something, and it's going to cost us more money. Not only is it going to cost us more money for the $50,000 in straight compensation of salary, it's going to cost us that much more money when we chip in for Social Security and Medicare. So we're costing ourselves a lot more money all along. That may be higher for our workers' compensation, et cetera. Job applicants may find the position qualification is just not right, so they're not going to be there. A job analysis is a great tool, but it's not a panacea for assuring that jobs are correctly described. A job analysis describes what is, not what might be. It may not be accurate due to skewed input and or faulty analysis. Most job analysis tend to be subjective. I always think about what we've done here: interviews, questionnaires, not observation, but those two, and they're the two most common. And different analysts will produce different results. Again, there's some built-in bias in an analyst. Now, don't think about built-in bias as being bad. It's not meant to be bad. It's just it's what happens. It's how that person interprets the data. So you need to have as much objectivity here as possible, and that's why collecting data through multiple methods is the best way to do it. Most job analysis, a job analysis must be constructed and aligned with the organization's mission, goals, and objectives. I've stated that before. I'll state it again. This has to be. A job analysis should be frequently evaluated. We talked about this early on, to assure they actually reflect what they say they're going to reflect. Now I'm going to give you a little bit more information here that comes from Stewart and Brown, and then I'm going to back that up a little bit with a slide from Henneman, Judge, and Kammerer, Muller, and that is on competency-based. I have to get there. Competency-based modeling. Stewart and Brown, as we mentioned before here, say that job analysis have come under considerable scrutiny in recent years because today's work is not as structured, not as lockstep, if you will, in some respects, as in previous years. Tasks are more knowledge-based, and an employee's mental capacities are put to greater use. Mental capacities, mental capabilities. As a result, competency modeling, which you can see here on the slide, has been developed as an alternative to traditional job analysis development. This method focuses on a broader set of KSAOs and also seeks to capture things such as motivation, values, and interests. These authors offer the following model for competency modeling, which they say seeks to link work activities with organizational strategy. The steps include And here's what this talks about here, and then we're going to get to the steps, which are fairly similar to what we've talked about. Again, determine what data you're going to collect. Now, this is a little bit different here because it says use interviews and focus groups. So let's go back to one of our original slides here. It does not talk about using focus groups. Now, focus group is a lot different because you're going to get people in there who have knowledge of the job, etc. And if you use a focus group, the job analyst is going to be coming up there and more than likely asking open-ended questions and then facilitating the conversation to elicit, further amplification on what's been said. And that comes down to the next step, open-ended questions. And you need to enlarge upon that, expound upon that, and add the oomph to it, if you will, to make it what you want it to be. I'm always leery about watching people. They're going to act differently. We know they're going to act differently. There's good data that says they're going to act differently. So you have to be careful about this observation. Obviously, it can be done so people wouldn't know you were watching them, and if that can be done easily, yeah, I agree to that should be undertaken. Just have to be careful about this because if people know that you're watching them, it's going to cause a lot of problems. Notice this next thing. It talks about identifying themes and patterns. Those are not as specific as actual tasks. Now, yeah, okay, something is you're going to say, yeah, okay, but that's fairly specific because we see it recurring. But it's not a task. It's not, doesn't come into a neat little compartment. It's different. It has to be thought about this. Notice here it talks about start from the general and then be open to gathering new information. And then you test the interim model again. You'd go back to your focus groups and say, okay, this is what we found, and give us get their input. It mentions surveys here, and I think that if we're going to start with a focus group, that we should stay with a focus group. A survey tends to be much more detailed and really doesn't allow, at least as far as I'm concerned, doesn't allow for not so much not asking open-ended questions. It does, but it doesn't give you the opportunity to get people to expound on the open-ended question because you're not there. And so my take on this is if you're going to use focus groups at the beginning, stay with focus groups throughout. Don't mix and match. Now, I suppose you could get a survey and then come back and say to your focus group, this is what we've got for the survey, and go from there. But I would not use a survey without going back to the focus group. And then, of course, you need to validate your model, and that would be the same in a regular or a normal job analysis construction. And you're going to have to see how well things correlate, and you're going to probably going to have to develop a working model, what you think is a working model. At least have some sort of a construct that you're going to work against, and of course that construct is going to be not as neat, in a neat little box with a bow on top, so it's going to fit in there. But you're going to start out with something that's loosely formed, I would say, And if this model that you're going to use is going to simply be something close to what you have now in your working relationships, et cetera, then it's going to continue to be that way. Now, there's also a motivational approach, and jobs are not simply designed to get work done as quickly as possible, but to provide workers with tasks they find meaningful and enjoyable. This follows along with the thing, and we don't talk about it in this course because we're not supposed to, a concept called job enrichment. And there's core characteristics that go on with job enrichment. And one of those things is giving the employee autonomy to do the job, giving him or her the resources to do the job, and giving there should be some task variety and task identity, and then giving feedback, but on performance, but not getting in the employee's way to stifle him or her. So you're motivating here through the job itself. Now, notice it does talk about the job characteristics model, but we do not talk about it in this course. This is coming from Stewart and Brown, which is a human resource management text, different than the text that we're using. So it is something that's there. They recognize this goes along with the core jobs characteristics model. Notice that this is intrinsic motivation, that the employee is being motivated by the job itself and his or her satisfaction from achieving high performance. It's not extrinsic. Somebody's not coming along and patting them on the back or giving them a certificate or increasing their pay. I mean, obviously, employees want that, but this is satisfaction from within. And this is a motivational approach. And if you're designing jobs, and by the way, this comes from job analysis, job description, job specification, the whole business. If you're motivating people through the jobs, then you're going to make the job that way. And so it looks upon it itself. Competency modeling tends to focus on strategy and is broader in scope, whereas a job analysis uses a specific scientific approach to gather data, interviews, observations, questionnaires, or a combination of those three. Those are all specific. Stewart and Brown conclude the best approach may be to use a method that combines competency modeling, its strategic approach, with scientific procedures used to complete a traditional job analysis. Now, as I mentioned, I want to give you a little bit of what Henneman provides. And Henneman provides this particular comparison of the types of job analysis. He has here, and I'm using Henneman besides this, there's other ones, Judge and Kammerer Mueller. By the way, it's a hyphenated last name, Kammerer Mueller. Notice he has method, process, and staffing implications. Now, if we look at the one on the far left, job requirements, and then process, and then staffing implications, this follows the traditional model of a job analysis, whether it's collected through interviews, observations, questionnaires, or a combination thereof. It follows what we've talked about from pretty much the beginning at 4:30 today. Competency modeling, it's a little different than what Stewart and Brown talked about, because if you look at the process, it talks about getting strategy from top executives and then reviewing how each job fits in with the mission, goals, and objectives of the organization. Stewart and Brown talk about that a little bit, but not quite as much. They focus more on KSAOs, which is okay because that's part of the deal. And then they come to the bottom and they talk about links organizational strategy with the planning process, et cetera, and then incorporates the KSO, broader KSOAs for selection. Now, the third model that they present, and I was talking to one of my colleagues today, this is a new model to me. This is job rewards. I've not seen this model before. This textbook I've gotten for Henneman, I've recently gotten, and I'm kind of trying to work through it. I've provided you some information that comes from Henneman because I think it's another good resource to use. But notice that it collects information from employees on their preferences. It's not collecting information on tasks mostly. Yeah, tasks are going to be involved in it. I like to do this task better than that task. But it's not as much task specific as it's in preference in performance of task. I prefer to perform this task first or always, as opposed to something else. And then the processor, it develops a series of rewards or potential rewards for both job incumbents and it surveys both the job incumbents and their supervisors and managers. And then staffing applications, look at this last down here. I want to read this to you. Provides guidance for how to develop recruiting materials and retention strategies based upon a job rewards job analysis. Very interesting. And so where competency-based modeling says we have moved beyond the traditional results-oriented job analysis, that's what I want to say. We have moved beyond that, and now we're into using the job analysis for not only recruitment, but also retention. And so we brought a new dynamic here into development of job analysis. And we're not just looking at the job itself, or we're not just looking at aligning it with strategy within the organization. And we're probably going to do that, aligning with strategy within the organization. But now we're using it as a recruiting tool and also to retain the employees that we do have. You know, we talked about this early on, that retention is almost as important as recruiting. And it may be even more important because we don't need to be having a revolving door. So I found this to be very interesting. I want to just give you a little bit about KSOAS here. Knowledge encompasses a body of information broken into conceptual, factual, and procedural knowledge. Skills, competence, and competence in working with gained knowledge to complete a task or a group of tasks. Ability is a measure of how quickly an individual can acquire and to what degree he or she can master the knowledge and skills required to perform a job. And then other characteristics are things like personality, values, interests, training, and experience. There is a website from the ONET organization, and when I conclude this tonight, I'm going to send that to you by email. You may be interested in looking at the website. Certainly no requirement. I'm not asking you to do that, but it's something that you will gain some extra knowledge from by doing. I'll send you that link. I also want to tell you that I will be out of the office tomorrow morning at a meeting in Columbus, Ohio, about 110 miles from here. I have to be up there by 9:30. I don't expect to be back here until about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Pardon me. So I will not have the lecture uploaded until later tomorrow, later than I normally do. I apologize for that. But there's not much I can do. But I tried to go up there on Tuesday, which was originally scheduled, but we had inclement weather both here and in Columbus, freezing rain. I didn't want to drive up in freezing rain and run off the road or something of that nature. So I hope you understand that. Anyway, I will send this link to you for the ONET site. that you might find to be very interesting. I thank you for your attention tonight, and good night.